Rolling Away the Stone, Mary Baker Eddy's Challenge to Materialism, by Stephen Gottschalk. Introduction. In 1889, at the age of 68, Mary Baker Eddy abruptly left Boston, where she had lived and worked since 1882. Settling in Concord, New Hampshire, near her birthplace, she looked forward to what she believed would be a period of rest and retirement from the labors that had all but exhausted her over the past 7 years. Instead, and perhaps to her own surprise, she entered into a period of just over 20 years of productive work in which the demands on her did not diminish, but grew. This book is a study of these last 2 consummatory decades of her life, during which she brought her work in Christian Science, begun in 1866, to completion. Other books have dealt with this period, most notably Mary Baker Eddy, The Years of Authority, the final volume of Robert Peel's biographical trilogy. This book, however, focuses on the dominant theme in her life during these 2 decades, her effort to protect and perpetuate a religious teaching that could provide an alternative to the materialism she saw as potentially engulfing traditional Christianity. In so doing, she acted not only as a Christian thinker confronting some of the most persistent issues of faith, but as a religious leader guiding a movement that, in the 2 decades before her death in 1910, would grow to national and even international proportions. Although she desired seclusion, Eddy felt that it was incumbent upon her during this period to take on the demands of leading the Christian Science movement, despite being a woman in a male-dominated society, and an elderly woman in her 70s and 80s at that. Beginning in the early 1890s, Eddy faced a continuing series of crises and problems linked, as she saw it, not only to the survival of the denomination she had founded, but to the future vitality of Christianity as a whole. The phrase, rolling away the stone, in the title of this book is drawn from a metaphor she used at various points to suggest what Christian Science, if conscientiously practiced, could mean to Christianity. It refers to the gospel accounts of the rolling away of the stone from the place where the resurrected Jesus had been entombed. What is it, Eddy asked at an Easter service in Boston 2 months before her departure for Concord, that seems a stone between us and the resurrection morning? That stone, she said, is the belief of mind in matter. A sermon she had given earlier was based on the text from Mark, "Who shall roll us away the stone from the sepulchre?" Here she says that this stone, in a spiritual sense, is the human view entertained of the power, resistance, and substance of matter as opposed to the might and supremacy of spirit. To her, that stone was the obstacle that would hide from our view the power of the Spirit of Christ to redeem the whole of human life. The advent of Christian Science, she insisted, marked a fresh, new sense of the continuing presence of Christ, which had been embodied in the man Jesus, but remained a healing presence for humanity. She saw the healing ministry of Christian Science as helping to rouse Christians to the great promise of restoring the power of the original gospel. What blocked the fuller realization of this promise, in her view, was what might be called the hidden metaphysics of traditional Christianity. Christian teaching in nearly all its forms held to the virtually axiomatic assumption that God was the creator of matter and finitude, and thereby the ultimate source of the suffering and death that human beings must endure. But the belief that man is physical, finite, and mortal, Eddy emphasized, is exactly what had been challenged and reversed by Jesus' resurrection, which she fully accepted as a literal historical fact. She taught, moreover, that just as the power of Christ had rolled away the stone from the tomb in which the crucified Jesus had been buried, so the continuing power of Christ as presented through Christian Science has rolled away the stone of the belief of life in matter from the sepulchre of mortality in which human hopes have been buried. Christians, she maintained, without ever quite realizing it, held to the belief in the effective supremacy of matter over spirit in daily life. If they not only held to, but defended this belief, they could not, in her view, escape the iron logic of seeing God as the ultimate source of suffering and death. For Eddy, as for countless others, this problem of what is technically termed theodicy was not a problem of logic, but a problem of life. It urged itself upon her as an issue that arose directly from the rigors of her own experience, from the pain and terror of the illnesses of her youth, the multiplying personal losses of the first 3 decades of her life, and the loneliness and near invalidism she experienced as a result. The problem of evil declared theologian Hans Küng, has become, in the age of Auschwitz, the rock of atheism. But atheism was no option for Eddy, who had been raised in the religious culture of latter-day New England Puritanism, the major expression in the New World of the broader Calvinist tradition. Eddy strongly questioned the doctrine of predestination, which most Puritans, along with other Calvinists, affirmed. But it would never have occurred to her to question the reality of one sovereign God, hence the spiritual quest that dominated the first half of her life. As she put it later, in her autobiographical work, Retrospection and Introspection, I was impelled by a hunger and thirst after divine things, a desire for something higher and better than matter, and apart from it, to seek diligently for the knowledge of God as the one great and ever-present relief from human woe. In 1866, at almost the exact midpoint of her life, she experienced what she believed to be a major spiritual breakthrough, as the result of being healed of the effects of a severe injury. This breakthrough she called her discovery of Christian Science. The metaphysics and theology of Christian Science were therefore far from being merely a statement of her personal religious views, but they were for her a making explicit of permanent spiritual truth that had been implicit in the Scriptures all along, a rediscovery, as she saw it, of the continuing truth and undiminished power of biblical revelation that traditional Christianity had largely failed to discern and act upon. Her healing in early 1866, she later said, included a glimpse of the great fact that I have since tried to make plain to others, namely, life in and of spirit, this life being the sole reality of existence. To Eddy, this breakthrough marked a revelatory understanding of God's true nature, that his being is infinite, an all-inclusive spirit, and that his creation must be, like him, spiritual. For her, this was not merely a conclusion arrived at through abstract metaphysical speculation. It was an inescapable consequence of what the Bible, rightly understood, reveals. Pursuing the logic of this conviction wherever it led, she concluded that the true understanding of biblical revelation ran counter to the assumption that God was the creator of matter and finitude. The Scriptures, she wrote, give the keynote of Christian Science from Genesis to Revelation, and this was the prolonged tone. For the Lord, he is God, and there is none beside him. Eddy believed that her teaching stood in stark contrast to and in active defiance of the worldview of materialism. In the broadest sense, she saw Christian Science as challenging this materialism, whether it took the form of the increasing domination of scientific materialism in Western thought, the pervasive assumptions of medical materialism, the ecclesiastical materialism that submerged spirituality in outward forms of ritual and creed, or especially the tacit materialism that nominally admitted the reality of God but denied that his power could have any direct effect in human experience. The bedrock tenet of scientific materialism, asserted Stephen M. Barr in his book Modern Physics and Ancient Faith, is that nothing exists except matter, and that everything in the world must therefore be the result of the strict mathematical laws of physics and blind chance. Materialism in this basic sense inevitably has a shaping effect on human values, leading to the sometimes unspoken assumption that having material possessions, comforts, and power is the only valid measure of fulfillment and meaning in human life. In an insightful summary of the modern materialist ethos, Richard Tarnas, in his book The Passion of the Western Mind, wrote that in contrast to earlier worldviews, materialism depicts the universe as an impersonal phenomenon, governed by regular natural laws and understandable in exclusively physical and mathematical terms. As this materialism took form, any sense of even a residual divine reality, if unsupported by scientific investigation of the visible world, disappeared altogether. As a result, science replaced religion as preeminent intellectual authority, as definer, judge, and guardian of the cultural worldview. Human reason and empirical observation replaced theological doctrine and scriptural revelation as the principal means for comprehending the universe. The domains of religion and metaphysics became gradually compartmentalized, regarded as personal, subjective, speculative, and fundamentally distinct from public objective knowledge of the empirical world. For Eddy, materialism had deepened and become more intransigent, not because it was on the ascendancy, but because it was fighting for its life. As she put it on the first page of Science and Health, the cold conventionality of materialism was fading away. The broadcast powers of evil so conspicuous today, she also wrote in that book, show themselves in the materialism and sensualism of the age, struggling against the advancing spiritual era. As she saw it, the only form of spirituality worthy of the name must engage to some degree in this crucial struggle with the materialism that claims to define and limit our possibilities at every point. The mortality of material man, she wrote, proves that error has been ingrafted into the premises and conclusions of material and mortal humanity. Traditional Christianity, she believed, had not sufficiently broken with these premises and conclusions to realize the full saving power of the gospel. Most forms of traditional Christianity teach that those who are saved are sinning, imperfect mortals now, but will become spiritual and immortal in a future life. For Eddy, this was a false point of departure in attaining the salvation that Christians seek, a spiritually crippling misunderstanding of the revelation that Jesus brought to humanity. The divine nature, she wrote in Science and Health, was best expressed in Christ Jesus, who threw upon mortals the truer reflection of God and lifted their lives higher than their poor thought models would allow, thoughts which presented man as fallen, sick, sinning, and dying. The Christ-like understanding of scientific being and divine healing includes a perfect principle and idea, perfect God and perfect man, as the basis of thought and demonstration. Beginning on this basis, Eddy insisted, provides a whole new understanding of what salvation actually means and requires. It certainly does not mean that men and women as we behold them now are perfect. Indeed, she sometimes outdoes Calvin in characterizing the sinfulness of the mortal picture of man. She spoke of the total depravity of mortals and characterized the common conception of mortal man as a burlesque of God's man. But she believed God's man, the man Jesus exemplified and revealed, is spiritual, perfect, and immortal right now. The true path to salvation lay in recognizing what she held to be this supreme spiritual fact and bringing it to light in daily life. The great spiritual fact, she wrote, must be brought out that man is, not shall be, perfect and immortal. The evidence of man's immortality will become more apparent as material beliefs are given up and the immortal facts of being are admitted. The struggle in which Christians must be engaged, therefore, is not the futile effort to make a poor, sinning mortal into a perfect, sinless immortal, for this can never be done. It is to give up the material beliefs that operate with hypnotic intensity in human experience and to admit and adhere to the immortal facts of being, despite the evidence of sensory testimony to the contrary. In her many descriptions of this struggle, Eddy characteristically employed military metaphors. She spoke of a warfare with the flesh, in which we must conquer sin, sickness, death, either here or hereafter, of the need for Christians to take up arms against error at home and abroad, of the fact that Christian science and the senses are at war, and that it is a revolutionary struggle. Eddy held little hope for the future of Christianity if it was not fighting on the right side, if it was not found struggling on behalf of the advancing spiritual era by breaking thoroughly from the hold of materialism, whatever form it took. This conflict, she believed, was not theoretical, but took place on the rough ground of everyday life through acts of spiritual healing. In her teaching, to understand that God's kingdom is, as Jesus said, at hand, enlarges one's sense of God's presence. Individuals begin to give up the fears and false convictions that proceed inevitably from the belief that material conditions are the final arbiter of human life and well-being. In proportion as this happens, what seem to be intractable physical conditions begin to change. Healing happens, not, in her view, through blind faith or miraculous divine intervention, but through understanding more of God's love and the supremacy of his power. This, said Eddy, was the basis of healing, in New Testament times, that she had rediscovered and made available in our own. She believed that the God whom Christians claim to worship must be a real God, having real effects in the world. If, however, humanity continued to be plagued by ineradicable woes from which Christianity offered no hope of surcease, she strongly doubted if Christianity had the staying power to survive the inroads of secular materialism. Since the last decades of the 20th century, a new theological consensus has arisen among many influential theologians, so much so that it is being called a new orthodoxy. Briefly, this viewpoint holds that the older conception of God as all-powerful is impossible to sustain, that he is unable to prevent human suffering, but that he is nevertheless present to us, suffering with us in pain he cannot prevent. In Eddy's view, the true understanding of God's omnipotence acts powerfully to ameliorate suffering, bringing practical healing to humanity through the recognition of his presence. In this context, she saw Christianity as coming to a crossroads. Far from accepting for Christian Science a marginal place on the fringes of Christian experience, Eddy saw its challenge to materialism as potentially having a major bearing on the future of Christianity as a whole, but only if Christian scientists practiced what she taught with sufficient dedication and effectiveness to give evidence of its truth. During the 2 decades before her death, the Christian Science movement grew with surprising speed. Largely, it gathered adherents from the ranks of disaffected Protestants who, like Eddy in earlier years, had not only experienced suffering, but found in that suffering a strong challenge to their belief in a God who could be responsible for evil. Artlessly, yet pointedly, the Christian Science Journal telescoped the whole issue by citing the story of a boy looking out of his window and telling his mother, "It's a funeral, Mama. God has been killing someone else." For many converts to Christian Science, Eddy's teaching validated the Christianity in which they desperately wanted to believe. As one Christian scientist early in the century put it in a testimony reprinted in Science and Health, that teaching did not really dissent from orthodoxy, but represented an ascent, an expansion, a going onward and upward from the point where dogmatic teaching and theology leave off. To new adherents from Christian backgrounds, Eddy's teaching felt like Christianity made alive again, released from the trammels of tradition, but more fully free to realize the promise of the gospel. Each of the chapters of this book revolves around a cluster of events and problems that Eddy faced during the last 2 decades of her life. In each instance, she confronted issues that proceeded from her effort to define and advance a new form of Christian spirituality that challenged materialism in its various forms. Since many of the problems she dealt with overlapped in time, the book is organized after the prelude according to a broadly chronological yet topical plan. For readers who wish to track the specific sequence of events in Eddy's life, a chronology emphasizing the period covered in depth in this book is provided. The prelude, entitled The World's Leaden Weight, focuses on a widely publicized lawsuit in 1907 challenging Eddy's mental competence and introduces issues explored in greater detail as the book progresses. The first chapter, Oh God, Is It All?, explores her struggle with the problem of evil, counterpoising the direction she took with Mark Twain's anguished confrontation with the same issue in the later part of his life. Chapter 2, Becoming Mrs. Eddy, focuses on how, after leaving Boston abruptly for Concord in 1889, she sought and found renewal in her own spiritual life as a Christian, becoming over the next several years the Mrs. Eddy with whom history has become familiar. The basis of her growing authority within the movement in the early to mid-1890s is explored in the following 2 chapters, By What Authority? On Christian Ground, and By What Authority? Listening and Leading. The fact that she was a woman leading a burgeoning religious movement raises a number of issues about the nature of feminine spirituality brought into focus in Chapter 5, Woman Goes Forth. The next 2 chapters, The Visible Unity of Spirit and The Preparation of the Heart, revolve around Eddy's work on behalf of her church during the middle and late 1890s. Chapter 8, Ayant Hates Thrall, explores the implications of a major crisis in Eddy's life when she faced a lawsuit engendered by a former student, Josephine Curtis Woodbury. Partially as a result of this crisis, she formed a remarkable community of workers in her household, delineated in Chapter 9, A Power, Not a Place. In the first decade of the 20th century, Eddy dealt with a series of issues revolving around what she saw as the opposition of materialism to Christian Science healing practice, or what she once characterized in terms adapted as the chapter's title, the outflowing life of Christianity. Concurrently, her efforts to confront the evidences of materialism within the Christian Science movement itself are discussed in Chapter 11, The Kingdoms of This World. The final chapter, Elijah's Mantle, dwells on Eddy's more interior experience during her last several years, while Lakota, the prophetic voice, points to her larger legacy as a Christian thinker. In the process of measuring up to the unforeseen day-to-day demands that devolved on her, Eddy found herself thrown back on the necessity of finding in Christian Science itself a basis for understanding the situations she faced, gaining the spiritual guidance she needed to meet them, and achieving the strength and staying power to go on leading the movement well into her 80s. The last 2 decades of her life, examined in this framework, offer a fresh perspective on the tough, persistent character of her own spirituality, as well as a persuasive gauge of the integrity involved in her rigorous commitment to living what she taught. In the words of religious historian Martin E. Marty, there's no doubt that in one sense she is doing what everyone from atheists like Sartre to intense believers like Pope John the 23rd are doing. They are putting their banner up against forces of meaninglessness and saying, I defy them. I don't have to be merely passive. Whether people can follow where her banner would lead is a very different question. But I think one has to say, here's a steadfast, decades-long attempt not thus to be overwhelmed.